Fantastic and exciting video. So today I want to talk to you about why exercise is so important to me and what it can do for you as well. So let's go ahead and start with some of the ways that people try to avoid exercise. So the first one is more or less back to the point of avoidance coping. So avoidance coping goes something like this. So for example, I'll give you a personal example. So for me, I have panic attacks a lot. And I'm always afraid of the countryside, of being out there or being away from a hospital because it sets off my panic attacks. So what I do to avoidance cope is I live near a hospital. I make sure that I'm around an emergency room at all times. I make sure that I'm living in the city, etc. Now, the problem with this is it's not actually addressing the problem or making sure that you get better or learning how to handle it should you ever be in that situation or ever need to go outside of the city, right? Like there are times where I need to go to another town to see a specialist or something. So then the problem becomes what then? So that's one way people often do stuff. So it's not actually dealing with the problem. Another is what we would call mental gymnastics, right? So mental gymnastics would be, for example, saying I don't have, making lazy excuses or for unjustifiable reasons, right? For unjustifiable actions. So a good example of this would be like, well, I don't have enough time to exercise, or oh, it's just too hard, or I'm not really feeling up to it. I'm feeling under the weather. When the truth is that exercise doesn't have to be a lot, and I've seen people all the time scroll and spend an hour on TikTok, but then they don't exercise. So that's a good example of mental gymnastics. Another way people might deal with stuff like this is projection. So projection is when you see or attribute undesirable qualities in somebody else that you in fact possess yourself. So you're not actually addressing the things you don't like about yourself. Instead, you're seeing them in other people and you're pointing them out. This takes away all the attention from yourself and directs it to somebody else because the reality of the situation may be overwhelming for you. And in fact, that goes hand in hand with denial. So denial is sort of like a rebuke of reality. So, for example, denial might be an example of, let's say somebody gains 50 pounds, right? They might just be like, well, I just have to do better. When a normal person, what will happen is they'll be devastated, especially if they gain all their weight back when they lose a lot of weight, right? They would be devastated. But for somebody in denial, they might lower the severity of the consequences, and this is another way to help soothe themselves. The problem with this is for every time that you dismiss the severity of these actions, you take one step away from reality into fiction. Before you know it, you're so deluded that the lies you're telling yourself you now believe. And we often see this with repeated chronic liars all the time. They're not actually living in the same world. So another thing I see people do all the time is blame shifting. So blame shifting could be something like, for example, let's say somebody doesn't get a job or they get fired from the job and then they blame it. Well, oh, it was my boss's fault. Or, oh, well, it was because, let's say they go into work and they get angry and they yell at somebody, right? And they cuss out one of their coworkers and they could go home and they blame their partner. Well, you didn't do the dishes and that pissed me off. So I went and, blah, blah. They're not actually owning up to accountability for themselves. And the problem with this, of course, is that this takes away one responsibility for yourself. So it makes you have a victim complex and inherently assumes that you're hopeless and that life is hopeless and there's nothing you can do about it. So it takes away any control and leaves you feeling powerless. But two, it also damages the relationships you have around you, because at some point people are going to start getting tired of this. Unfortunately, actions do speak louder than words. So when your actions show constantly that you're not willing to change, at some point it doesn't become that you had a bad day. This becomes more of this is a feature of your character, especially if it's repeated. Another thing I see people all the time do is emotional detachment, right? And in this case, for example, they might do something like when somebody hears that they're having heart problems or that they're going to die, they're hearing these awful things that could happen, and they might not see to live to be 60 or 70 or whatever. They might just completely detach themselves from it, and they might ignore the situation. They might disengage from it. And the reason is, again, this is a way of self-soothing for yourself. And unfortunately, the problem with this is if you don't ever admit there's a problem, how can you even go about solving it? And which is why it's important to engage it. So 2 things that I see often that can help determine whether or not somebody's going to lose weight in people is whether or not is the client proactive or are they reactive. So proactivity would be, for example, you need to lose weight. So right ahead, day 1, you stop eating the fast food, you do some research, you make sure you exercise. You're taking accountability and responsibility. You don't need anybody to tell you right away that you need to start exercising or that you need to start doing stuff. You make sure that you, at the end of the day, know you're responsible for your actions, for your motivation, for your willpower. I heard a really good thing that my therapist told me, and they said, I'm only the GPS. At the end of the day, it's up to you whether or not you take the directions I give you. And that's something really important that I think a lot of individuals could do to keep in mind. So, and then reactive is constantly waiting for somebody else to tell you what to do. The problem, of course, with this being that if you don't have that guidance, then you tend to fall off. And especially if it's bad guidance, then you're just going off what other people say. This can make you not only susceptible to do something stupid, but very gullible. It prevents you from ever becoming truly independent and thus becoming the best version of yourself. Not only this, but with you waiting on that, that's more time spent in reinforcing bad habits. It's also not consistent because you're not always going to have these specific situations where you have specific people 24/7 big brother baby monitoring you. It's just not realistic. So what happens if when at some point in time you have to become independent or you're met with temptation and you have not done the proactivity to prevent that temptation from drawing you back to your old habits? Well, the problem becomes now you're probably going to go back to it. So, of course, that goes with self-awareness. And self-awareness is just simply the idea that you understand the problem, you know what you have to do, and you know how a situation looks to somebody else. You're looking at it from an outsider perspective, and you're being completely objective and unbiased. Oftentimes, I see people do not practice what they preach. And I believe there's a big difference between practitioners and I guess you could call them preachers. So a preacher would be somebody who simply says what they've read, who simply speaks about what they've heard in a book or seen on TV. But a practitioner is somebody who actively tests the things that they're learning and reading about and acts, and makes sure that they're not only is this good for them, but this can do many different things. It can inspire other people. This can act as a chain reaction. So what can happen is, because you're doing something good, somebody else sees what you're doing and thinks, hey, I can do that too. And now they're inspired. And that goes along with radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is just that. It's accepting that you have to change and there's nothing else to it. Because what happens when you open the door for other avenues is shortcuts, laziness, and overall a regression back to old habits. The sooner you accept the truth, the sooner we can move on to treating the issue. Obesity is a disease, and it's okay to admit that. Being obese does not lower your value as a person or change what you can give to society as a human being. It does not mean you are any less. What it does mean is you are at increased risk for hundreds of cancers, for many different types of heart diseases, and all this equals an early death or a poor quality of life. I have seen many old people. I have seen many fat people. But in the time that I've done my research, study, and practice, I have not seen many old and fat people. I just have not. So, there's something else that is equally important to consider. What is the root cause of all this? Well, I think one is validation that people are getting. So Tess Holliday is a good example of this, and I respect Tess Holliday, but I do not respect what she's doing. She's selling the idea that you can be morbidly obese and be healthy. Now, the issue with this, of course, is that's an oxymoron. You can't be morbidly obese and be healthy. And what people often do is they say, well, my blood pressure's good, my blood work's good. But for me, it's kind of confusing because it's almost like when a high-functioning alcoholic or a chain smoker says, well, my blood work is good. Right now, it's good. And I think that's great that right now it's good. But the issue becomes you're at increased risk. And to deny that is to deny decades upon decades of extensive science and research in the sake of comforting yourself because you don't want to feel bad emotionally. But then there's the other problem, right? If you were okay with this stuff truly, then you wouldn't be looking outside for people to, one, validate you, and two, talking about how you want this to be different. Because what I find often is when people say, well, they're okay with being morbidly obese, what they really mean is, look, I want the results, but the work behind it is exhausting. Ronnie Coleman did a really good saying. It's the idea that people want short-term gratification. They want the results, but they want it in the easiest way possible without the hard work. The truth is you're going to have hard work, which is why we see all these things like Hydroxycut and these diet fads. They promise an easier way. There's all these commercials that promise people that you're going to be able to lose weight without exercising, or you put this strap around your stomach and all of a sudden you watch the pounds melt off. It's appealing to people's need for results with the least amount of resistance. And I think that's really scary. So, the thing with Tess Holliday is also people live vicariously through her.
Understand that as an obese person, you want to surround yourself with people who give you positive reinforcements and give you positive feedback and love you and tell you you're beautiful and everything. But you know what? The people who don't tell you that you need to change at 300, 400, 500, 600, 800 pounds are people that don't love you. People who love you will never go and tell you at 300 and 400 pounds, let's go have pizza. They will never tell you, let's go have Chinese buffet and let's go do this and that and, eat more and more. Be in the movement that lets you live a longer, healthier life and be there for your family and your kids and your parents and your significant other. Don't be in the movement that tells you to stuff your face with cake. Be in the movement that tells you, you know what, you're beautiful, but we need to do something so you don't get diabetes, so you don't get cancer, so you don't have to have a limb, cut off, so you don't die of a heart attack or have a fatty heart or a fatty liver or all these kind of things. It's so dangerous. Even if your blood work is fine right now, you don't know what will happen in a year. You don't know if the last slice of pizza that you're eating is going to give you a heart attack, because our body does not deserve what we are doing to it. My body does not deserve to be this big and fat.
So somebody sees Tess Holliday and they say, well, she's rocking it. They say she's beautiful. She has a body like me, so that means I must be beautiful. And it almost starts to act as a comfort, amongst that group, and they start to feel better about themselves. Hold that thought. Getting a call. Okay, sorry about that. I had a call. So I just want to sort of wrap this up, and it's going to be sort of a multi-part thing because there's a lot to kind of get over here. But the other part becomes, with all these issues, it becomes sort of like a self-fulfilling prophecy where I say I can't do it, and because you say you can't do it, then when ultimately you fail, you say, well, look there. You see that? I knew it all along. I knew I was a fuck up. I knew I was a failure. And this self-fulfilling prophecy does nothing for us. It just harms us. So there's this thing called neuroplasticity, okay? And neuroplasticity is essentially the idea and the acceptance now in the clinical literature that our brains are very palatable and we can change our attitudes, behaviors, our habits, and the way we do stuff. So the one thing that you want to make sure that you understand is that no matter what, you're going to be in discomfort, and that it's not going to be easy at first with the hardest of things. See, over time, I found that things don't necessarily always get easier, but you get better at handling those difficult things. So that's why they seem easier. And your mindset as well, the way you look at something has to change. So for example, let's say day one is hard, right? On the job training, right? You go to a new job and it's very difficult at first. And you're like, fuck man, I don't know any idea what I'm doing. But then day 2, okay, you learn a little more. Day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6, day 7, you're learning more and more, which is great. And by week 2, if all goes well, you picked up the job, and then a month, 2, 3, 6 months into the job, you ain't even got to think about it because you just got that damn good at it. And it's the same way when you go and learn. Like, for example, with me, learning about psychology was really hard day 1. And it's still difficult now, but I got really good at it because I kept constantly studying. So now I made a challenge to, instead of writing scripts, I started writing keynotes. But even now, what I want to do is I just want to rattle off the information. So I kept practicing, and I failed a bunch. But what I learned is I developed techniques. One of them being is whenever I find that I'm losing my train of thought, I just start speaking slowly. And by speaking slowly, I allow my mind to catch up with my mouth. And I can process the thoughts I want to say more clearly and not trip over myself. If I'm running at 100 miles per hour, it's going to be hard to dodge the objects that are coming in front of me than if I'm trying to dodge objects running at 5 miles an hour. You get what I'm saying? So for this, back to my point, it would be like, let's say you have a giant Big Mac in front of you. So you could think, that smells so good, that sounds so great, that's yummy. Or you could change the way you think about it, and instead you could say, look at how many calories that has. It's a big fat ass burger. It's super unhealthy for me. It's not even all that tasty. It's quite expensive. And I could make something just as good, if not better, at home. So, with our brain, what happens, I see a lot of times, is our brain is designed to protect us. And it can be good because it tells us to do stuff like, don't go into the water with sharks. Or, don't jump in front of a train or out of a moving car. And this is great. But by that same token, our brain can limit us in becoming the best version of ourselves possible. So there's a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. The fixed mindset is all about safety. The problem is that it's so safe that there's never room for growth and improvement. And when you fail, it feels like defeat. When instead, it should be this way. You either win or you learn. And that way you tackle the subject again and again. The Colonel had his recipe for KFC's chicken rejected hundreds of times and still pushed through. I have a video on that, by the way, I recommend you watch. And he still pushed through and did better. And eventually he got his recipe, he was able to get his recipe patented, which is amazing. It takes a high level of dedication to do something like that. So it's important to recognize that failure is not bad at all. In fact, it's a natural part of life. So the growth mindset is all about understanding that failure is a natural part of life. So to the next thing, I want to start off by saying, I believe in you guys, and I know you can do well. Now, there's a great quote by Floyd, and to be the best, you have to work overtime. And I always like that. And even at his age now, he always says, no, I don't want to go to the gym for a third time. I would rather be at home watching TV. And it's interesting because it's like, even if you hate to do stuff, you should do the stuff you hate like you love. I see all the time where high-level runners, they're smiling and they're having a great time when they're running. And they're waving to the crowd. And they're just super excited. And they're singing to themselves. And I asked myself why. And I found that, here's how it goes, right? So when you do that, your brain goes, oh, we're enjoying this. And what it does is it signals to your brain that this is a fun activity. And so it changes your mindset. Because just the way when you're watching a comedy special and you're laughing and you're smiling, you're having fun, when you're doing exercise and you laugh and you have fun and you're doing all these different things, it's a way to indicate to your brain that, hey, this is something fun, this is not treacherous. When I exercise, for example, I go really hard, and one thing I'm a big fan on is I don't care who hears me, but I start singing, I start sprinting, I dance every once in a while. I'll literally wave my arms back and forth and like even stretch out my arms and lift up my head and just make myself as peacocked as possible, because I want to indicate to myself that and to the world that this is something I enjoy, this is something I love. It's also about comparing yourself to who you were yesterday instead of to other people. So what I see a lot of times is people will compare themselves to other people. The problem with this is it can make you feel like a fuck up or a failure, especially if you're holding yourself up to unrealistic expectations. Instead, what I think you should do is ask yourself, what type of person was I yesterday? And what type of person I am today? Where have I seen improvements? To remind yourself of that. Equally important is your goals. You need to make sure that you have the highest of high goals for a number of different reasons. And this is something I could talk about forever, but because there's so many points I want to go over, I'm going to be quick about it. So for this, my goals are high, so my results are high. The reason I push myself through hell on everything I do when it comes to physical exercise is because the reasons for it is high. And I remind myself of that every day when I feel like quitting. I remind myself of why I start in the first place when I feel like I'm at my lowest. And another thing that I would recommend doing is when you get up, first thing in the morning, exercise for a couple of different reasons. But the biggest one is that the longer you wait to exercise, the more time you have in the day to procrastinate, and the more time you have to think. And the more time you have to think, the more time you have to make up excuses of why you could take today off. So I would do it first thing in the morning. The other thing is a good start to motivate yourself for the rest of the day as well. So not only do you feel great because you just started running, but this allows you to create a good habit for other things. So if I'm running every day and I'm being consistent with it, then this is going to carry through to maintaining schedules for other things. If I'm running every day at the same time, at the same pace, the same progress, then maybe I'll work at the same time, same pace, same progress. Maybe I'll do videos same day, same time. You know what I'm saying? It builds a habit of staying consistent with yourself. And listen, I know it's scary, right? I know that it can be scary. The fear can do this. And people like to use that as a motivator. And I think fear can be a good motivator. But the problem with that is people sometimes ask, well, why do people gain weight and then lose weight and then gain it all back? Well, for different reasons. But two of the biggest ones is people don't appreciate what lifestyle means. Lifestyle means for life. It doesn't mean a temporary thing. A radical fad diet, the reason that it's so hard to maintain that is they're not thinking long-term about if they can do that for the rest of their life. Willpower is finite. So that's a problem right then and there, is you're making radical big changes, but are they sustainable? It would be the equivalent of asking yourself to run as fast as you could and maintain that pace for the entire race. It's just not sustainable to go nuts to butts 100% the whole time. You have to pace yourself. You can only expect so much. Instead of a radical diet, maybe cutting back a couple hundred calories in a day might be more consistent, something you can maintain way longer for life than going to a diet and essentially starving yourself, and then next thing you know, you binge eat. I know, for example, there's a lot of intermittent binging where people will go on a 24-hour fast, and then they'll just completely go haywire on that meal because they're so hungry they're not even thinking about it. Yeah, Snickers would say, "You're not you when you're hungry." And the other thing is, I think this one is equally just as important, is that fear is only a good motivator when there's something to be afraid of. So, let's say you lose the weight, and you no longer have high blood pressure, you're no longer at risk for other types of illnesses or diseases. Well, now that the fear is gone, now that the risks are gone, where is the motivation? If you base it all on fear, then it becomes hard for long-term consistency once it's no longer there. Instead, what I'd recommend is a combination of reminding yourself of all the positives you'll gain, along with a healthy dose of rational fear. So, what do I recommend for running? Well, there's a few different things. But of course, let's start with some basics. So first of all, don't think about it, just do it. Don't overcomplicate it, or you're going to find yourself overwhelmed before you've even started. Make sure you bring water and a running partner. This friendly rivalry can help you lift each other up to the best of your abilities. Think like Goku or Vegeta, right? So also, changing the way you think of fatigue. Now this one's important. Instead of just thinking about fatigue, people assign all sorts of other emotions to fatigue. So they might just think, well, I'm tired, I'm uncomfortable, I'd really like to stop, I'm going to constantly check my watch, oh my god, how much more do I have to go? And they're paying, and 100% of focus is all on fatigue. Well, what I recommend you to do is divert your attention away from it and to think of it differently. So a good exercise I like to do on it is just letting the feeling come, recognizing it, and letting it go. Okay, I'm tired. That's as far as it gets for me. So then I start counting my steps. I go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Or I do math problems in my head. I love that. Math problems is one of my favorite ways to do it. I recommend complex math if you can. Because what this does is it requires a lot more attention. And so it diverts your attention away from that to the complex math problem. You can't think about something else and then do that problem when it requires all your attention. And listen, remind yourself of why you started in the first place, okay? Whenever you feel like quitting. And ask yourself, why did I start in the first place? And if I quit now and I go back to what I was at the beginning, then why did I do all this for? And how's that going to make me feel? Am I really willing to deal with that? Another thing that helps is breathing in through your nose and out through your mouth, at least for the first minute of each mile. And this can help to reset your breathing, help you prevent from hyperventilating, and set a good pace for the rest of the run. So here's another one. Imagine you're working an 8-hour shift that day, right? If you constantly look at the clock, it's going to feel like it's taking forever. Instead, what I recommend doing is think of the 8-hour day instead of break it into increments. So you have 4 2-hour periods with a 5-minute break in between. Not only does this make it seem more bite-sized and digestible, you wouldn't eat an entire steak in one bite now, would you? Cut it up into smaller pieces. But what this can do is those breaks allow you to reset, essentially, both physically and mentally. So if I have a 15-minute run, I like to break it up into 3 5-minute segments with a minute rest in between. So, on to the next thing. We're going to have to say this, just flat out, okay? You have to have a reason that's bigger than yourself. And I say that again and again, but it can't just be for you. It has to be for other people too. Like your kids or your partner or whatever it may be. So, motivation is important. But what I've said before about Just Do It is you have this impulse to do something. You ever thought you were going to get up and dance at a high school ball or anything like that, and you didn't get up and dance? You had the impulse to do it. You had the impulse to do something, maybe be social, but you didn't do it. And as the seconds go by, the feeling gets weaker and weaker and weaker. Well, this is the way it is with most things, if not all in life. When you get that impulse to do something, you better act on it, because chances are you're not going to do it later. And you and I both know this. This is called activation energy. Motivation, consistent motivation, might I specify, is not done through waiting. Rather, it is made through starting it. So, with that all being said, I want to thank you guys for watching, and I want to thank you for listening. I hope my thoughts were coherent and they made sense. So, make sure you be well and you be happy. This is Cow King signing off.